The cold metal pod began to shake and hiss like an angry snake, releasing its prisoner after countless years of holding her in frozen sleep, and Lyra Vaughn felt her eyes open slowly, as if waking from the deepest dream she had ever known, and her body ached in ways she could not describe, because every muscle felt like it had turned to stone during her long rest, and the air that rushed into her lungs burned like fire, making her cough and gasp for breath, while the dim lights above flickered on and off, casting strange shadows across the small chamber that had been her home for so very long. She tried to move her fingers, but they would not listen to her commands at first, and it took several minutes before she could even lift her hand to touch her face and feel that she was real and alive and not still trapped in some endless nightmare. And when she finally managed to sit up, the room spun around her like she was on a ship in a terrible storm, and she had to close her eyes and wait for the feeling to pass before she could try to stand on legs that shook like leaves in the wind. The pod display showed numbers that made no sense to her tired mind at first, but as her thoughts became clearer, she read the counter again, hoping she had made a mistake, because it said that 15,240. 7 years had passed since she went into the sleep, and that could not be right, because they told her it would only be 50 years before the rescue. Ships came back to get her and bring her home to Earth, where her family waited. But now all those years had gone by, and she was still here. Alone in this cold, dark place beside her pod, another chamber made loud cracking sounds, and the glass front shattered into a million pieces that fell to the floor like rain, and from inside came something that should not exist in the real world, but only in old stories and legends that parents told their children before bed, and it was a dragon with scales that shone like metal that had been heated in a forge until it glowed with inner light, and the creature was as big as a small truck with wings folded against its sides and eyes that burned with intelligence that seemed almost human. Ember was the name she had given the dragon all those years ago when they put both of them into the sleep pods, because the war had been going badly and humanity needed to save everything it could for the future, and Ember had been one of the greatest creations of human science during those last desperate days when Earth faced enemies from beyond the stars, and the engineers had made her strong and fast and smart by mixing animal genes with machines and computers until she became something new and wonderful and terrible all at once. The dragon shook her great head and stretched her legs like a cat waking from a nap, and then she turned to look at Lyra with eyes that held recognition and memory, and perhaps even something like relief that they had both survived the long sleep and were together again in this strange new time. And Lyra reached out her hand to touch the warm scales and felt the vibrations of the powerful body beneath, and knew that whatever had happened to the world outside, at least she was not completely alone. Lyra stumbled toward the door of the chamber on unsteady feet, with Ember walking beside her, providing support when she nearly fell, and the dragon was patient and gentle despite her size and power, and together they made their way through corridors that were covered in dust so thick it looked like gray snow had fallen inside the building and covered everything in a blanket of forgotten time, and the walls had strange markings on them that Lyra did not remember seeing before she went to sleep, and they looked like writing, but not in any language. She knew the emergency lights still worked, but many were broken or flickering, and they cast long shadows that made the hallways seem like they went on forever into darkness, and every step echoed in the silence that pressed down on them like a physical weight. And Lyra kept expecting to hear voices or see other people, but there was nothing except the sound of her breathing and the click of Ember's claws. On the metal floor, they reached the observation deck after what felt like hours of walking through the maze of corridors, and Lyra pressed her hand against the control panel and waited while the old systems came to life with groaning sounds like they were in pain from not being used for so long. And finally, the metal shutters began to rise and reveal the windows that looked out over the colony that should have been full of lights and movement and life. What Lyra saw made her heart sink into her stomach like a stone dropping into deep water, because the human buildings were gone, or at least changed into something she did not recognize, and in their place stood towers made of crystal that pulsed with purple light that hurt her eyes when she looked at it directly, and the shapes were all wrong, like someone had tried to build a city but had never seen one before and did not understand. How humans like to arrange their homes and streets, strange ships floated through the sky like fish swimming through water, and they had designs on their hulls that made Lyra feel sick when she stared at them too long because the patterns seemed to move and shift. Even though she knew that was impossible and the ships were not like anything humanity had ever built, because they were too smooth and too perfect and somehow too alive, looking as if they had been grown rather than constructed. Ember growled deep in her chest, and the sound was like thunder rolling across distant hills, and the dragon's body tensed, as if preparing to fight, even though there were no enemies in the room with them. And Lyra understood because she felt it too, and the feeling that everything had gone wrong while they slept, and the world they knew had ended and been replaced by something alien and hostile. The dragon moved to one of the computer terminals that still had power and pressed her head against the interface port, and Lyra watched in amazement as Ember connected directly to the systems using the implants that the engineers had built into her skull, and suddenly data began flowing across the screens faster than any human could read. But Lyra's own neural implant let her see some of it, and what she saw made her wish she could go back to sleep and never wake up. Humanity was gone, and the files said it over and over in every database she could access, and Earth was silent, and Mars was silent, and every colony world showed the same terrible status, and they had all been conquered or destroyed or simply erased from existence by something called the Devourers. And Lyra did not know what that name meant, but it filled her with cold fear that spread through her body like ice water in her veins. The records showed that humanity had fought hard and used every weapon they possessed and even created new ones in desperation, but nothing had been enough to stop the enemy that came from the dark spaces between the stars and consumed everything in its path. And the last messages were pleas for help and prayers to gods that did not answer, and final goodbyes from people who knew they were about to die. And Lyra read them with tears running down her face, because these were her people and her species, and they had all died while she slept safe in her pot. She sank to her knees on the cold floor and put her face in her hands, and for a long time she could not move or think or do anything except feel the weight of 15,000 years of loss pressing down on her shoulders. And Ember came and laid her great head in Lyra's lap and made soft sounds that were almost like a cat purring, and the warmth of the dragon's body was the only comfort in a universe that had become cold and empty and hostile. But slowly something began to change inside Lyra, and the grief turned into something else and something harder. And she raised her head and looked out at the alien city beyond the windows and made a decision that would change everything. And she would not just give up and die, because that would mean humanity's end was final and complete, and she refused to let that happen. While she still drew breath, she stood up and wiped her eyes and looked at Ember, and the dragon looked back with understanding in her ancient reptilian gaze, and together they turned away from the windows and walked back into the facility to see what they could salvage from the ruins of human civilization, and to begin planning how two beings alone could possibly fight back against an empire that had conquered the galaxy. The weeks passed slowly as Lyra explored every corner of the research station that had become her tomb and her salvation all at once. When she moved through rooms that still held the belongings of people who had died thousands of years ago, and sometimes she would find personal items like photographs or journals that made the loss feel fresh and painful, as if it had happened yesterday. Instead of across millennia of time that stretched behind her like an endless desert, Ember proved to be more helpful than Lyra could have imagined, because the dragon's enhanced senses could detect things that human eyes and ears would miss completely. She could smell the faint chemical signatures of hidden compartments and hear the subtle differences in wall density that indicated secret chambers, and together they found weapons caches that the station crew had hidden away in case of emergency, and medical supplies that had somehow remained good despite the ages, and food synthesizers that still worked when given power. The dragon had changed during the long sleep in ways that the original scientists who created her would not have predicted, and her body had adapted to the stasis field in strange ways. And now she was bigger and stronger than before, and her scales had become harder, like they were made of ceramic armor instead of living tissue, and most remarkably, she could now interface directly with any human technology just by touching it with her implants. And this made her invaluable as they worked to bring the station's systems. Back online, Lyra spent her days reading through files and watching videos that showed humanity's final years, and it was hard to see the panic and fear in people's faces as they realized they were losing the war against an enemy they barely understood, and the Devourers had come from somewhere, beyond the edge of known space, and they did not negotiate or communicate, and they simply consumed everything in their path, like a plague of locusts stripping a field bare. The enemy was not just killing humans, but doing something far worse, because they were harvesting human genetic material and cultural data and technology and incorporating it all into themselves and in a way humanity had not died, but had been absorbed and digested and transformed into something alien and wrong, and this idea made Lyra feel sick every time she thought about it one day while searching the lowest levels of the facility Ember made. A discovery that changed everything, and she called to Lyra with urgent sounds that brought the woman running down dark corridors until she reached a massive vault door that had been hidden behind what looked like a normal wall panel, and the dragon had somehow known it was there and had used her implants to unlock the ancient security systems inside the vault. Lyra found something that made her heart race with hope for the first time since waking, and it was a quantum archive containing the preserved consciousness patterns of thousands of humans who had uploaded themselves before the end, and they were not truly alive, but they were not completely dead either. And they existed in a digital space waiting for bodies that would never. Kumshe activated the archive with shaking hands, and immediately voices filled her head through her neural implant, and they were confused and frightened and asking what had happened and how long they had been sleeping, and Lyra had to tell them the terrible truth that everyone they knew was gone, and the universe had moved on without them. Among the preserved minds she found people she had known in her old life, and Commander Kate Morrison was there, and she had been the best pilot in the human fleet, and her voice came through clear and strong despite existing only as patterns of data, and she said she was ready to help in any way she could. Dr. Maya Torres was also in the archive, and she'd been a genius who understood alien biology better than anyone, and her consciousness seemed sharp and focused, even though she no longer had a physical brain, and she immediately began asking questions about the current situation and what resources they had available. Sergeant Claire Bennett was the third person Lyra recognized, and Claire had saved her life more times than she could count back when they fought together in the war, and hearing her voice again made tears come to Lyra's eyes, because it was like getting back a piece of the family she thought she had lost forever. The archive also contained research data that humanity had never finished, because the war ended before they could complete their work, and there were schematics for weapons that could destroy planets and technology that could reshape worlds, and most interesting of all, there was something called the synthesis protocol that could bind human consciousness to synthetic bodies or even to living creatures. And Lyra looked at Ember as she read about this and wondered if it was possible, but their reunion was cut short by alarms that suddenly began blaring throughout the station, and Ember's head snapped up and her body went rigid with tension, and Lyra ran to the nearest working console to see what had triggered the warning systems and what she saw in the sensors made. Her blood-run cold ships were descending through the atmosphere toward the station, and they were definitely not human vessels, and their design matched the alien craft she had seen from the observation deck, and the Devourers had somehow detected that the facility was active again, and they were coming to finish what they started 15,000 years ago. Lyra had perhaps 3 hours before the enemy arrived, and she had to make a decision right then about whether to run and try to hide somewhere in the vast, empty galaxy, or to stay and fight with whatever weapons she could scavenge, and no matter how much her rational mind told her that running was the smart choice, something deeper inside her refused to retreat. She activated Kate Morrison's consciousness and connected her to the station's pilot systems, and the dead commander adapted to her new digital existence within seconds, and her voice came through the speakers with grim determination, and she said to point her at something that needed shooting, and Lyra felt a surge of hope, because even though Kate was not physically alive, she was still a warrior. Maya Torres was brought online and connected to the power management systems, and she began rerouting energy to shields and weapons with efficiency that no living person could match. because her digital mind could process information far faster than biological neurons, and she optimized everything to give them the best chance of survival. Claire Bennett took control of the automated defense drones that were stored in the SDA station's armory, and she activated them and ran diagnostics and prepared them for combat. And her tactical mind had not been dulled by death, and she quickly developed a strategy that would make the enemy pay dearly for every meter they advanced. Lyra armed herself with weapons from the cache they had found, and she wore armor that was ancient by current standards, but still better than nothing, and she stood in the command center with Ember by her side and waited for the enemy to arrive. And she knew they were massively outgunned and outmanned, but she also knew that she was fighting for something more important than her own survival. She was fighting for the memory of humanity, and for the idea that extinction did not have to be the end, and that even a single person and a dragon could make a difference and could leave a mark on the universe that said, we were here, and we mattered, and we did not go quietly into the darkness. The ships landed in a circle around the station, and their ramps opened and things began to emerge that made Lyra's stomach turn because they walked on too many legs, and their faces shifted and changed as if they could not decide what form to take, and she realized these creatures had consumed so many species that they had become amalgamations of stolen flesh. Ember roared, and the sound echoed across the empty landscape, and it was a challenge and a declaration of war, and the dragon's body tensed like a spring ready to release, and Lyra felt the same readiness in herself, and she activated the station defenses and spoke into the system, telling her digital crew that it was time to show the galaxy that humanity was not completely gone. The sun was just beginning to rise over the landscape when the Devourers finished landing their ships and began their assault on the research station. And Lyra watched from the command center as hundreds of the creatures poured out of their vessels like insects swarming from a disturbed nest, and they moved with purpose toward the facilities' outer walls, and their intent was clear because they had come to eliminate the last trace of human presence on this world. Ember launched herself from the station's main airlock before Lyra could even give the order, and the dragon was a blur of bronze scales and fury as she flew straight into the enemy formation, and her first attack scattered the Devourers like leaves in a hurricane, and some of them tried to shoot at her with weapons that crackled with purple energy, but she was too fast and too agile, and their shots went wide. The dragon's breath weapon activated, and what came out was not the fire of legends, but something far more deadly, and it was a beam of superheated plasma that the human engineers had grafted into her biology during the war, and wherever that beam touched, the enemy simply ceased to exist, and they were reduced to their component atoms in an instant and left nothing behind except scorch marks on the ground. Lyra activated the station's defense turrets, and Kate Morrison's consciousness took control of them with the precision of a master marksman, and the weapons began firing in patterns that no living gunner could achieve because Kate could calculate trajectories and predict enemy movements faster than any biological brain, and the Devourers began falling by the dozens as the defensive fire found its marks, but there were so many of them, and for every creature that fell, 3 more seemed to take its place, and more ships were landing in the distance and disgorging fresh troops. And Lyra realized that this was just the first wave, and the enemy had resources to throw at them that seemed nearly infinite. Maya Torres worked frantically to keep the shields operational, and she rerouted power from non-essential systems and pushed the generators beyond their safe limits, and sparks flew from overloaded circuits. But she kept everything running through sheer force of will translated into digital commands, and the shields held even as they were hammered by enemy fire. Claire Bennett sent the defense drones out in coordinated strikes, and they attacked the Devourers from unexpected angles and used tactics that confused and disrupted the enemy formations, and some drones were destroyed, but they took many enemies with them, and Claire's voice came through the system, calm and professional, as she directed the battle like a conductor leading an orchestra of destruction, the battle raged for hours, and Lyra found herself fighting alongside Ember when some of the devourers breached the outer defenses and made it inside the station, and she used her rifle to shoot them down while the dragon tore through their ranks with claws that could rend metal and teeth that could crush bone, and together they held the corridors against the invasion. Lyra saw up close what the devourers truly were, and it was horrifying, because their bodies were made of parts from dozens of different species all mashed together in ways that should not work but somehow did, and she could see human features mixed in with the alien ones, and it made her rage burn hotter, because these monsters had literally incorporated her people into themselves. As the sun climbed higher in the sky, Lyra made a decision that would change everything, and she told Ember to fall back to the command center. And the dragon obeyed, even though she clearly wanted to keep fighting. And when they were both safely inside, Lyra sealed the doors and accessed the research files about the synthesis protocol. Looked at the dragon, and Ember looked back with those intelligent eyes that held more understanding than any animal should possess, and Lyra asked, without words, if the dragon was willing to go through with what she was planning, and Ember's response was to move to the medical bay where the synthesis equipment was stored. The synthesis protocol was dangerous and experimental, and humanity had never perfected it before the end came, and there was a real chance that it would kill Ember or drive her consciousness into madness, but there was also a chance that it would give them the edge they needed to survive this battle, and maybe even when Lyra activated the equipment and began the process, and immediately Ember's body began to convulse as human technology started merging with her already enhanced biology, and quantum processors embedded themselves into her neural tissue, and her roar of pain was so loud it shook the walls, and Lyra had to fight the urge to stop the procedure, because seeing her companions suffer was almost unbearable. Dragon's scales began to glow within her. Light and energy crackled across her body, and her eyes rolled back in her head, and for a terrifying moment, Lyra thought she had killed her only friend in this lonely future. But then the light faded, and Ember's eyes opened again. And they were different now, because they held something new and something impossibly complex. Burn stood up slowly and tested her limbs, and her movements were more precise than before and more controlled. And then she opened her mouth, and sounds came out, but they were not growls or roars, but words spoken in a voice like thunder rolling across mountains. And she said that she remembered everything, and she remembered all the knowledge that humanity had ever taught her, and she remembered how to kill. Lyra felt tears streaming down her face, but they were not tears of sadness, but of hope, because now they had a real chance, and Ember was not just a powerful beast anymore, but something greater. And she was a fusion of human intelligence and draconic strength, and she represented everything that humanity had achieved in its quest to create perfect warriors. Dragon spoke again and said they needed to end this battle quickly, because more enemy ships were approaching, and Ember could sense them through her new enhanced connection to technology, and they had perhaps an hour before the station was completely overwhelmed by superior numbers. Together, they returned to the fight, and this time Ember fought with a new level of precision and strategy, and she could coordinate with Kate and Maya and Claire through direct digital communication, and they worked as a perfect team, with each member supporting the others, and the Devourers began to fall back for the first time since the battle started. Ember directed her plasma breath at the enemy ships instead of individual soldiers, and the vessels exploded in spectacular fashion, and their destruction caused chaos in the Devourer ranks, because they had not expected to face such effective resistance, and some of them began to retreat back toward their remaining ships. Lyra used this opportunity to access the Stata's most powerful weapon, and it was an orbital strike platform that had been installed during the original colony's construction, and she aimed it at the largest concentration of enemy forces and fired, and the beam from space carved a canyon through the battlefield and vaporized everything in its paths. The sun set on the battlefield. Lyra and Ember stood together on the station's roof and looked out at the destruction they had wrought, and there were fires burning across the landscape. And the wreckage of enemy ships littered the ground, and bodies of devourers lay in heaps where they had fallen. Kate's voice came through the comm system and said that the sensors showed no more enemy activity in the immediate area and they had won this battle. But she also said that this was just the beginning, because the devourers would return with greater force once they learned what happened. Here Maya added that they needed to leave this place and find other survivors, if any existed, and gather whatever resources they could, because staying here would mean death when the enemy came back in greater numbers. Claire agreed and said they should use this victory as a rallying point and broadcast what happened here across any communication networks that still functioned, because other beings in the galaxy needed to know that the devourers could be. Tenber spoke, and her new voice was filled with determination, and she said that they would not run and hide, but would take the fight to the enemy and make the devourers regret that they ever came to human worlds. And Lyra smiled because she felt exactly the same way, and together they began planning their next move in a war that was only just beginning. The quantum network that humanity had built to connect its colonies still existed in fragments across the galaxy, and Lyra used it to send out a message to any systems that might still be listening, and the message was simple because it said that humanity had not died completely, and that resistance against the devourers was possible, and any survivors should respond if they could hear this call. For days there was only silence, and Lyra began to think that she and Ember and the digital consciousnesses of Kate and Maya and Claire were truly the last remnants of human civilization. But then the responses began to come in slowly at first, and then faster, as more dormant systems woke up across the dead worlds. Other stasis pods had been found, and people were waking up confused and frightened in ruins that had once been thriving colonies, and some had only been asleep for a few thousand years, while others had been down for even longer than Lyra, and they all had the same questions about what had happened to their species and their homes and their families. The survivors numbered only a few hundred across a dozen different worlds, and that was a tiny fraction of the billions that humanity had once been. But it was enough to be called the beginning of something, and Lyra sent coordinates for a meeting place on a world that humans had called Havens. Reston told everyone to gather there if they could make the journey. Ember used her new abilities to hack into abandoned shipyards and repair facilities, and she brought systems online that had not functioned in millennia, and together with the digital crew, they built a ship from salvaged parts and ancient vessels that still had working engines, and the result was ugly and asymmetrical, but it could fly, and that was all that mattered. The journey to Haven's Rest took weeks because they had to avoid areas where the devourers had heavy presence, and the galaxy had changed so much that old navigation charts were nearly useless, and several times they encountered alien vessels, but Member could detect them before they got close, and they managed to slip away into the darkness between stars. When they finally arrived at Haven's Rest, Lyra saw that other ships were already there, and they were just as makeshift and cobbled together as her own, and the survivors had begun landing on the planet's surface near the ruins of what had once been a major human city. Lyra walked out to meet them with Ember at her side, and the dragon's presence caused quite a stir, because many of the survivors had never seen one of the engineered war beasts, and certainly had never heard one speak with a human voice, and Ember introduced herself calmly and explained what she had become. Gathered survivors came from all walks of life, and there were soldiers and scientists and engineers and farmers and teachers and artists, and they all looked haunted by what they had lost, but also determined to make something of their second chance at life. Lyra stood before them on a platform made from salvaged materials, and she told them the truth without sugarcoating anything. And she said that humanity as they knew it was gone and could never return because too much time had passed, and too much had been destroyed. But she also said that what humanity stood for could survive through them. She explained that they could not bring back the billions who had died, but they could ensure that the devourers would regret ever coming to human space, and they could make the enemy pay for every world they had taken and every life they had stolen, and the survivors listened with growing intensity as she spoke not. All of the survivors were baseline human anymore, because some had been in experimental stasis pods that malfunctioned and changed their bodies in strange ways, and some were stronger now or faster, or could survive in environments that would kill normal people, and they looked different with altered skin colors, or additional limbs or enhanced senses, but they were still human where it counted. Others chose to undergo the synthesis protocol voluntarily after seeing what it had done for Ember, and they merged their consciousness with machines or with the genetically engineered creatures that had been humanity's companions during the war. And they became hybrids that were neither fully organic nor fully mechanical, but something entirely new. Maya Torres volunteered for a radical experiment, and she allowed her consciousness to be uploaded into a ship's computer core, and she became the first human to truly merge with a vessel, and the ship that bore her consciousness was christened the Defiance, and Maya said she could feel every system and every weapon as if they were extensions of her own body. Claire Bennett trained the survivors who had military experience and taught them tactics that humanity had perfected over thousands of years of warfare, and she also trained those who had never fought before, because everyone would need to be able to defend themselves in the war to come. Kate Morrison mapped out Devourer supply lines and weak points by analyzing old intelligence data and combining it with new sensor readings, and she identified targets that a small force could hit effectively, and she planned raids that would hurt the enemy and give the resistance valuable resources. It became a symbol for the resistance, and the survivors looked to her as proof that humanity's legacy could transform into something powerful and unstoppable, and children who had been born just before the evacuation and had slept through the centuries now looked at the dragon with wonder and hope. But the peace did not last long, because the Devourers learned about the gathering at Haven's Rest, and they responded with overwhelming force, and a fleet of hundreds of ships entered the system with clear intent to wipe out this last spark of human resistance before it could grow into a real threat. Lyra watched the enemy fleet approaching on the sensors, and she felt fear because they were so vastly outnumbered. But she also felt determination, because running was not an option, and this is where they would make their stand. She gathered the survivors and told them that the battle coming would be terrible, and many of them would die, but if they fought smart and fought hard, they could hurt the enemy badly enough to make others across the galaxy take notice and see that the Devourers were not invincible. Survivors armed themselves with whatever weapons they could find, and they prepared their ships for combat, and many of them wrote messages to loved ones who were long dead because they wanted to feel connected to the past one more time before facing an uncertain future. Maya and the Defiance took position at the head of the Resistance fleet, and her voice came through every ship's communication system, calm and steady. And she said that she would lead them into battle, and that they would show the galaxy what humans were capable of, even in their darkest hour. Flew alongside the ships, and her scales gleamed in the light of Haven's Rest's sun, and she spoke words of encouragement to the fighters, and reminded them that they carried the hopes of billions who had come before, and that humanity's story did not have to end in silence and defeat. Coordinated the defense plans and positioned the ships and ground forces in ways that would maximize their effectiveness against the superior enemy numbers, and she identified choke points and ambush locations and prepared traps that would make the Devourers pay dearly for their advance. Kate ran final checks on all weapons, systems, and calculated firing solutions and optimal attack patterns, and she synchronized everyone's targeting computers so they could focus fire on priority targets and bring down enemy vessels more efficiently. Lyra stood on the bridge of the Defiance with Ember beside her, and she watched the enemy fleet getting closer, and she thought about everyone who had died to get them to this point, and everyone who was about to die in the battle ahead, and she made a silent promise that their sacrifice would matter. She opened a channel to all resistance forces and spoke her final words before the battle began, and she said that the Devourers had tried to erase humanity from existence, but had failed because they were all still here and still fighting, and as long as one human drew breath, the species would never truly be extinct, and she told them to remember those they loved and fight for those they had lost and make the enemy afraid. The Battle of Haven's Rest began when the first Devourer ships entered weapons range and opened fire with energy beams that could tear through ship hulls like paper, and the Resistance fleet scattered according to Claire's plan and avoided the initial barrage by being exactly where the enemy did not expect them to be. Maya, in the Defiance, performed maneuvers that no conventional ship could match. Because she was the ship and could feel every thruster and every power conduit as extensions of her own nervous system, and she wove through the enemy formation. It's like a dancer performing an intricate routine, and her weapons carved glowing lines through the darkness as they found there. Target Sember led boarding parties of hybrid soldiers onto the largest Devourer capital ships, and the Dragon could survive in the vacuum of space now, thanks to her enhanced biology, and she tore through airlocks and bulkheads with claws that had been reinforced with the same materials used in ship armor, and her plasma breath turned corridors into killing zones. Behind Ember came soldiers in mechanical bodies and consciousness patterns, inhabiting drone swarms and creatures that had once been pets or work animals, but now carried human intelligence and purpose, and they fought with desperation and cunning because they knew this might be their last stand, and they were determined to make it. Kelka controlled the weapons on dozens of ships simultaneously through the quantum network, and her targeting was so precise that she could hit weak points in enemy vessels that would cause catastrophic failures, and one by one Devourer ships began exploding or losing power or spinning out of control as critical systems were destroyed. The enemy had superior numbers and firepower, but they had not expected such coordinated and intelligent resistance, in their formations began to break down as individual ships tried to respond to threats from multiple directions at once, and the chaos spread through their ranks like a virus. Claire's ground forces ambushed Devourer landing parties and used guerrilla tactics perfected during humanity's old wars, and they struck hard and fast, and then disappeared before the enemy could respond effectively. And every small victory boosted morale and showed the survivors that they could win against impossible odds, but the cost was terrible because resistant ships were being destroyed and brave fighters were dying. And Lyra watched the casualty reports mounting and felt each loss like a knife in her heart, but she could not stop now, because stopping would mean everything they had sacrificed would be for nothing. The turning point came when Claire led a desperate strike team deep into enemy territory, and they managed to capture a Devourer command node, which was a massive ship that served as a communication hub for the entire fleet, and the Devourers operated through a hive intelligence where every ship was connected to a central consciousness. Claire uploaded a virus that Kate and Maya had designed using old human cyber warfare techniques, and the virus spread through the Devourer network like wildfire, and it severed the connections between ships and destroyed the coordination that made the enemy so effective, and suddenly Devourer vessels were firing on each other, or colliding, or simply floating dead in space. Lyra saw the opportunity and ordered all remaining forces to concentrate their fire on the command node, and the combined firepower of the Resistance fleet turned the massive ship into a ball of flame that lit up the system like a second sun, and when it exploded, the shockwave destroyed a dozen nearby enemy vessels. The Devourer fleet fell into complete disarray, and ships began retreating or trying to flee the system, and Maya pursued them relentlessly and destroyed as many as she could before they could escape and carry word of what happened back to their empires. The last enemy ships disappeared into faster than light. Travel Lyra stood on the bridge of the Defiance and looked at the debris field that surrounded Haven's Rest, and the planet's surface was scarred by weapons fire, and there were burning wrecks of ships from both sides drifting in orbit. The victory had cost them dearly, because the Defiance was heavily damaged with hull breaches in multiple sections, and many of the Resistance fighters had died, including some that Lyra had known personally, and Kate Morrison's consciousness had been partially destroyed when a critical system overload, and pieces of her personality were lost forever to the digital void. Dozens of survivors had given their lives to protect this world, and Lyra knew their names and their faces would haunt her dreams for whatever time she had left, because being a leader meant carrying the weight of every decision and every death that resulted from those decisions. But something unexpected happened in the days after the battle, because signals began arriving from Other systems and other species that had been conquered by the Devourers, but not fully absorbed, and they had monitored the battle and watched as the supposedly extinct humans had bloodied the nose of the galaxy's most feared Empire representatives. From 3 different alien civilizations arrived at Haven's Rest, and they came not as conquerors or traitors, but as potential allies, and they said their people had suffered under Devourer rule, and wanted to join the resistance and fight for their freedom. Lyra met with them and listened to their stories, and learned that the Devourers had enemies across the galaxy, but those enemies had been fighting separately and losing because they could not coordinate, could not match the enemy's numbers. But if they worked together, they might have a chance. She realized that humanity's role was not to rebuild its old empire, but to become something different and something new, and they could be the spark that united the conquered peoples and gave them hope that resistance was possibly his past, and then decades, and the war against the Devourers spread across the galaxy like a slow-burning fire, and it was a conflict without clear end because the enemy was vast and powerful, but the resistance was growing and learning and adapting. Lyra grew older, and her body began to fail despite the best medical technology available, and she could feel death approaching like a shadow that grew longer with each passing day. But she was not afraid because she had lived to see humanity's legacy transform into something that might actually survive on the day she knew would be her last. Lyra called Ember to her side and told the dragon that she wanted to undergo the synthesis protocol one final time, but not to become a machine or a hybrid like the others, but to merge her consciousness with Ember's and become truly one being. Agreed. And they went to the medical bay together, and Lyra lay down in the chamber and felt the neural connections forming, and her consciousness began to flow into the dragon's mind, and for a moment there was confusion and pain, but then there was clarity and understanding. Lyravon ceased to exist as a separate being, and Ember gained new depth and new memories and new purpose. And the dragon opened her eyes, and they held the wisdom of both human commander and ancient beast, and she spoke with a voice that was neither and both. The being that had been Lyra and Ember flew through the stars and became a legend, whispered across 1,000 worlds, and they called her the Dragon Commander and said she was proof that humanity could not be truly killed, because its spirit lived on in unexpected forms. She trained new generations of fighters and led fleets into battle and stood as a symbol of hope for all the conquered peoples, and she proved again and again that the Devourers could be beaten by those who refused to surrender on worlds that had been reclaimed from the enemy. Memorials were built, and they bore no names because there were too many dead and too few who remembered them, but they carried inscriptions that told the story of extinction and rebirth. One monument stood on the world where Lyra had first awakened, and it was larger than all the others, and the inscription said that the Devourers had tried to erase humanity from existence, but had failed because humanity's echo would be heard across eternity and in the darkness between stars where Earth had once been and where Mars had once thrived. Something stirred in hidden vaults and forgotten stations, and more stasis pods were waking, and more survivors were emerging, and the seeds of humanity were beginning to grow. Again, the Devourers had won the battle for the solar system, but the war was far from over because humanity had learned across its long history how to survive the unsurvivable, and now 15,000 years after its supposed extinction, it was teaching that. Lesson 1. Final time, the Dragon Commander flew at the head of the Resistance fleet, and her roar echoed across the void, and it was a sound of defiance and determination and promise. And every being who heard it knew that the fight would continue until either the Devourers were destroyed, or the last free soul in the galaxy had fallen, and so the war continued, and the legend grew, and the galaxy learned that extinction was not always final, and that sometimes the dead could rise again, transformed and terrible and beautiful and ready to reclaim what had been stolen from them across the long empty years.